Welcome. Why did the American Civil War take place? Some would choose one or another topic, for example, slavery, or perhaps the Constitution. But, in truth, no event, much less any war, takes place for just one reason. In fact, as wars progress, new reasons for fighting may develop, new reasons that complement rather than displace older justifications. We see this especially clearly when we analyze the works of President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln hated slavery, and yet, when the Civil War began, abolishing slavery was not his first priority. It only emerged as the war progressed. And, late in life, as the war dragged on, the president's own writings and personal reflections were further punctuated with religious language and concerns. Together, these developing reasons ultimately laid the foundation for the 13th Amendment. And, what is more, many of the amendments that later followed. Today, we're going to analyze a series of works, both texts and speeches, by President Lincoln. Read together, they tell the story of his developing perceptions of not just the American Civil War, but of the American Constitution and ultimately of American ideals. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidency. It was an unusual race because instead of having two candidates, it had three. He handily won the Electoral College, but not the popular vote. Just under 4 million votes were cast, and of these, Lincoln received 1.9 million. His two opponents therefore had to split the remaining 2 million, and this put Lincoln ahead. Practically overnight, some Southerners complained that, with Lincoln now president, emancipation was a foregone conclusion. The race for Southern secession thus commenced before Lincoln took office, and on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded, the first state to do so. At the time, presidential inaugurations took place in March rather than January, and so some months passed before Lincoln could really do anything. He used his first inaugural address to try and allay at least some Southern fears. He repeated a statement that he had made previously. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Lincoln opposed slavery, but he also loved the Constitution, and he believed that slavery was, at bottom, an issue of states' rights. But in this address, he also advanced a particular view of the Constitution and how it united individual states. I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual. Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments. It is safe to assert that no government proper ever had a provision in its organic law for its own termination. He thus rejected the constitutionality of South Carolina's secession, but he also warned them in the penultimate paragraph of his speech. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. And this is exactly how it played out. When Lincoln delivered his address, there was no armed rebellion, at least not yet. But this changed on April 12, 1861, when Confederate troops attacked Fort Sumter, a federal fort located in South Carolina. With this event, the Civil War began. And now, President Lincoln, barely a month in office, had to make good his promise to preserve, protect, and defend the Union. The Constitution was paramount in Lincoln's first inaugural address, and after almost 18 months of fighting, little had changed in Lincoln's stated reasons. We see this in a letter dated August 22nd, 1862. It was written to newspaper editor Horace Greeley. After receiving the letter, Greeley published it in his newspaper, the New York Tribune. In it, Lincoln makes clear that his fundamental concern was to preserve the Union. He writes, "I would save the Union. I would save it the shortest way under the Constitution." And then he offered two alternative approaches, each of which he disagreed with. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. Each alternative had a longer pedigree in earlier American history. Those who supported slavery would have sympathized with the first alternative, while abolitionists would have supported the second. Lincoln, however, refused both. The primacy of the Union, as defined by the Constitution, remained paramount. But of course, things develop. Despite his letter to Greeley, President Lincoln was already considering the abolition of slavery. In fact, months before he wrote Greeley, he had drafted an early version of what is now known as the Emancipation Proclamation. And, in some ways, the Emancipation Proclamation came close to embracing the second alternative that Lincoln rejected in his letter to Greeley. Simply stated, in the Emancipation Proclamation, the President concluded that the Union could only be saved if slavery were abolished. But his conviction on point developed only in fits and starts. In fact, an early attempt at emancipation failed. This came in 1862, when Lincoln proposed a plan for the gradual emancipation of slaves in Delaware, one of the border states that remained in the Union but also retained slavery. The Delaware state government rejected the president's proposal, and they openly questioned whether the president even had the constitutional right to propose emancipation. This challenge left its mark on the final version of the text of the Emancipation Proclamation. It was issued on January 1st, 1863. If your focus is on slavery, then the key quote appears quite late in the document. "I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are, and henceforward shall be, free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons." But this was no act of governmental fiat. Earlier in the proclamation's third paragraph, Lincoln gave a constitutional justification for emancipation, describing it as a wartime measure. It was issued, in his words, "By virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion." Three things thus came together here: saving the Union, preserving the Constitution, and abolishing slavery. Lincoln is justly famous for the Emancipation Proclamation, but he is just as well known for the Gettysburg Address, which he delivered on November 19th, 1863. It's a comparatively short speech, but it powerfully communicated his understanding of the United States' most important ideals. Now, as a fun fact, there is actually no one version of the Gettysburg Address. Rather, there are 5 versions, and they differ from one another ever so slightly. For example, one version might have a comma, where another version does not, or one version uses the word upon, whereas another version uses the word on. In fact, we see this in the opening line of the address. "Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." From this point in the speech, Lincoln began to use more religious language. He spoke of consecrating and hallowing the very ground of Gettysburg. But he believed that, even as president, he could not do so because the soldiers, by their blood, had already done so. Given the religious tendencies in Lincoln's later writings and speeches, it is probably fair to see this imagery as being, at least in part, biblical in origin. And so, the Gettysburg Address concludes with a kind of religious vow, albeit one made with primary reference to values found in the Declaration of Independence. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. When it comes to the Constitution, President Lincoln was quite conservative and therefore quite reticent about changing the Constitution. But he began pushing for a 13th Amendment in 1864. He handily won the presidential election that year, winning 55.4% of the popular vote and nearly 90% of the Electoral College. He used this to push Congress to ratify the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery. The 13th Amendment was proposed on January 31st, 1865, but only ratified at the end of the year on December 6th, and therefore after President Lincoln's assassination on April 15th. What matters for us now is the first section of the amendment. It reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction." This basically made the contents of the Emancipation Proclamation parts of the Constitution. And, once part of the Constitution, it not only applied to those states that joined the Confederacy, but to those that remained in the Union, as well as to any and all territories and future states. So what? At this point, I want to pan out and get a little philosophical. In 2007, sociologist Gary Allen Fine published a short essay entitled "The Construction of Historical Equivalents, the Red and Brown Scares." He wasn't concerned with the American Civil War, but his essay matters because of how he defines historical equivalence. He writes, "Historical equivalence refers to the perception that two events, separate in space and time, belong to the same cognitive category or speak to the same issues. Put another way, they are good to think together." When we engage in historical equivalence, we tend to treat one historical event as somehow analogous to another. Let me explain with an illustration. After the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, there was a sudden reemergence of interest in the medieval Crusades. In fact, President Bush described the Second Gulf War as a crusade, and Osama bin Laden described American soldiers as crusaders. But is this fair? Is it helpful to connect an event of the early 21st century with a series of events that began almost 1,000 years earlier? If your answer is yes, then you are engaging in historical equivalence. That is, you think it's helpful to interpret together the Crusades and 9/11. In Gary Allen Fine's words, you think that the Crusades and 9/11 speak to the same issues. But do they? Historical equivalence brings with it a risk. To continue with this example, if 9/11 and the Crusades are read together, then 9/11 can appear as parts of a much larger 1,000-year struggle. And that brings with it, in turn, tremendous emotional force. And the bigger one's emotions, the easier they often are to manipulate. Admittedly, this is an ethical and political concern, but there's also a historical argument to be made. Do 9/11 and the Crusades speak to the same issues? My own answer is no. It's not helpful to think these together. The Crusades and 9/11 are so very far apart that there must be more immediate causes behind the more recent of these two events. And you can probably see where I'm going with this. In the modern-day United States, the American Civil War is a kind of proxy for any number of other, more recent matters. That is, the Civil War is thought together with matters as diverse as race relations, states' rights, constitutional interpretation, and the list goes on. I've observed that when the Civil War is thought together with more recent events, those more recent events begin to appear as part of a struggle that extends all the way back to the early 1860s, and sometimes even earlier. That's a lot of emotional force, and that might prove dangerous. In conclusion, allow me as a historian to offer my perspective on how to think about historical equivalence. Simply stated, the further apart two events are from one another, the less of an impact the older event has upon the more recent one. I'll say it again. The further apart two events are from one another, the less of an impact the older event has upon the more recent one. To borrow from the British historian Herbert Butterfield, in his famous 1931 essay, The Whig Interpretation of History, history is not the study of origins. Rather, it is the analysis of all the mediations by which the past was turned into our present. If you have to cut out a lot of intervening history in order to think together two different events, you'll probably misrepresent at least one of them. You might even misrepresent both. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. First are two books in the Oxford University Press series, A Very Short Introduction. One is The U.S. Civil War, A Very Short Introduction by Lou Major. Its chronological narrative offers a concise and helpful overview from the beginning to the end of the Civil War. To further place Lincoln's life in context, then read Lincoln, A Very Short Introduction by Alan Guelzo. Guelzo is one of the world's leading scholars of the 16th president, and his short volume is especially strong on the development of Lincoln's ideas. For a general overview of President Lincoln, the best place to start is with a selection of his writings and speeches. Many of the writings used in this video can be found in Abraham Lincoln, Selected Speeches and Writings. It's a volume in the series Library of America, which also contains a larger multi-volume collection of Lincoln's literary remains. Finally, to analyze the intersection between Lincoln's presidency and the Civil War, read Lincoln and the Civil War by Michael Burlingame. Deeply rooted in primary sources, it's part of a larger series as well, the Concise Lincoln Library, which is perhaps the best place to go for topical studies of Lincoln and his legacy. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.